has a grounding in the Great Depression and the New Deal, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response. Now, like I said, this is going to be the shortest possible version. I'm going to leave out a lot. I'm going to leave out some nuance and some complications because I just want us to have sort of a baseline understanding. And then if we have time, I'd like to focus for a couple of minutes at the end on the New Deal in San Antonio and how San Antonio benefited from specific New Deal features. So let's just jump right in. Hi, Monica, good to see you. We're just going to jump right in. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to either unmute yourself and ask a question, or I want to make sure that I have chat pulled up. So if you have a question or a comment, feel free to put it in chat and I'll come and glance at those occasionally. Hi, Lindy, good to see you. So I was just telling Justin and Monica, we're just getting a sort of baseline understanding of the Great Depression and the New Deal. And I'm going to be leaving so much out because this could be like a 3-hour lecture, but you did not show up for that. So we're going to try and stick to half an hour. If you need to leave, of course, feel free to come and go as you need to. I'm going to share my screen though to show you. There's this PowerPoint that's in the module, and you can always open my PowerPoints that are in the module. And let me pull this up. All right. Make sure I got the right one. Here's the right one. All right. So you can always pull up these PowerPoints in the module. And if you pull up the PowerPoint and download it, you can actually even see my notes. So a lot of my lecture notes are in the notes section of the PowerPoint. But I'm just going to run through a couple of slides on this PowerPoint of the New Deal to just focus on a few aspects of the Great Depression. Now, I know that if you're paying attention to the news or just talking to others, you're hearing a lot about the Great Depression right now. I know that there's been a lot of comparisons in recent weeks to the stock market fluctuations, as well as the unemployment numbers that are coming out. We're seeing about 15 million unemployed Americans right now. And I know you're seeing a lot of comparisons to the Great Depression. And just as a word of caution on that, we don't want to draw too many parallels because, of course, a global pandemic is a very different situation than the Great Depression that begins in 1929. So this is a good time to be talking about the Great Depression in the news so much. And there are certainly, it's certainly worth looking at as historical precedent, as well as the federal spending that FDR utilized to pull America out of the Great Depression. These parallels are very real. But like I said, if someone says, I know what's going to happen next because I've looked at the Depression, the situations are different enough that we should be cautious about that. But you probably know that in October of 1929, what becomes known as Black Tuesday, the American stock market does crash. And this is a global depression. And there's a lot of reasons that I'm not going to go into, by the way, but part of it is the legacy of World War I. That when Germany can no longer pay back its enormous debts to Britain, France, and America, we see a domino effect. That's not the only cause. We also know that in the 1920s, the stock market is this bubble, right? Growing, and it'll never burst. Bubbles never burst, right? Of course they do. And that bubble did burst. So we had a lot of unregulated stock market action that led to some reform like the Glass-Steagall Act, which by the way was undone in the 90s, but going into too much detail, so let me pull it back. Very basic, stock market crashes in 1929, $10 billion of market value disappears. Understand that the stock market was a lot smaller than it is now, so we want to compare percentages because $10 billion in today's stock market isn't as much as it would have been then. Now, but this is a high percentage here. So the United States quickly found itself as part of this global Great Depression. Like I said, Germany defaulted on its reparations to France and Britain, so they stopped paying back their debts to the United States. And banks failed as millions of Americans went and at least hundreds of thousands went and took their money out of the bank. You know, when you go to the bank today, you'll see on the door of the bank, FDIC insured. That means that if your bank fails tomorrow, like some of them did in the crisis of 2009, if your bank disappears and is suddenly a different bank next week, you're safe because the federal government has insured it, I think up to $250,000. A sum that I've never had to worry about, up to a pretty high sum. That federal insurance didn't exist. So if your bank failed in 1929, you could lose all of your money. So these bank runs were people going to the bank, withdrawing their money out of fear that it would be lost. And of course, the bank doesn't have all of your money back in a vault. Your money is invested. So banks are failing in part because of these bank runs. So it gets a little bit of a rebound and then crashes again. One of we do want to pay attention to with the stock market crash of the Great Depression, it doesn't crash once. There are repeated crashes in 32, 34, and 38. By 1932, the low point of the Great Depression, that is the worst point of the Great Depression, the gross national product is down. Prices are down by 40%. That might sound great. Like, wait, everything's half off. It's not great. It means that people don't have money to spend. 25% of the labor force is unemployed. So unemployment hits 25% by 1932. Now, from 29 to 1932, and we see, of course, these famous images of people lining up for soup kitchens. Keep in mind that there's no welfare as we understand it. There's no SNAP benefits. There's no unemployment insurance. Those are all a result of the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression. They don't exist yet. So private charity is quickly overrun with their ability to help. And from 29 to 32, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, gets a lot of blame for what people see as inaction. And I want to temper that blame a little bit because Herbert Hoover is responding to his economists, to experts who don't quite yet understand the way that we do, that the American economy has come to depend on consumer spending. Instead, Herbert Hoover's advisors tell him, look, a little bit of Great Depression is going to be good for the country. People will remember how to save again. People will stop buying things on credit. The market will reassert itself and everything's going to be fine. Without an understanding of how reliant the economy was on consumer spending, that probably sounded pretty rational. And the idea that, hey, maybe people should spend less money and save more money might sound good. Like, yeah, that does seem realistic. The problem was the economy was not going to be able to recover without that consumer spending. And Herbert Hoover wasn't getting that message from his economists and his experts who were very much aligned with that free market, laissez-faire, hands-off, government shouldn't intervene in the economy, the market will right itself. So Hoover gets a lot of blame at the time, and you see these shanty towns, these are people squatting, building homes for themselves, and people call them Hoovervilles, blaming Herbert Hoover for his relative inaction. This is going to make it relatively easy, I'm going to skip some stuff, for Franklin Delano Roosevelt to absolutely sweep the 32 elections. We have never seen the electoral share and the popular vote. We've never come close to these numbers. I mean, just the map itself, you're already going to be like, you can't imagine this happening, right, in 2020. You could see here that he got 88.9% the electoral vote. Almost 90% of people voted for FDR, and the electoral vote was 472 to 59. I'm so sorry. The popular vote, 57.7%. Okay, that's a lot less dramatic than 90% because I was reading without thinking. That might seem really undramatic. 57% to 38, you know, our popular share margins for the last couple of elections have been much, much narrower than that. We don't see those kind of popular vote percentages. But yeah, that electoral vote too, 472 to 59, we don't see that. FDR will be elected, by the way, 4 times. He will be elected president 4 times. He's the reason that we have a law now that says you can only be elected twice. He'll die in his 4th term. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself there with that. Pretend you don't know when he dies. I want to talk for a minute about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, he comes in on a promise that he's going to make big changes, that he's going to use the federal government to respond to the Great Depression. And this is a very popular message. Now, I want to talk a little bit about FDR's legacy, because the initiatives, the agencies, the money that he's about to spend that we call altogether the New Deal will fundamentally alter Americans' relationship, the relationship of Americans to the federal government. And it creates a new meaning of economic freedom that means not simply economic opportunity, but one that promises economic security. Now, for this reason, conservatives in FDR's own time and later and into our time will be very critical of FDR, this vastly expanded federal government, vastly expanded federal budget, all of these new agencies and initiatives that FDR created. Conservatives will be very critical of them. I think sometimes what's missed in this criticism is that FDR's goal and the outcome, honestly, is to preserve American capitalism. So if you might hear someone say FDR is a socialist, that's really not true. FDR sees two growing threats in Europe: fascism, Nazism, and fascism in Italy under Mussolini, and communism under Stalin. He sees both of those as threats. And there's a real fear by 33 that the only people in America that seem to be offering a solution is the American Communist Party. There's a real genuine threat that Americans will become more interested in communism as they see these failures of unbridled capitalism. So FDR comes in, his goal is to preserve American capitalism. Now, he does this through a vastly expanded federal government and through vastly expanded federal spending. The other thing that you might hear, I'm not an economist, obviously, and I respect economists' work. They do very interesting things with like modeling and thousands of models to see what might have happened. And sometimes economists like to say this would have happened if FDR had changed this or that fiscal policy or federal spending policy, it would have gone differently. Or they might say, look, I think the markets would have eventually sorted themselves out. And that very well may be true, that eventually the markets, without intervention, the markets would have fixed themselves. I think this is why you need historians, because economists will say, look, the markets would have fixed themselves. And then historians run into the room and they throw open the door and they're like, people riot for bread when they're hungry. So that's always the missing factor, right? What if FDR had done nothing? What if Hoover had won? There may have been riots. In American history, people do tend to riot when they're hungry, which is something that George Washington had to deal with as well. All right, taking too much time. Telling you too many details. What's the first thing that he did? FDR invented a bank holiday. He was like, banks are closed, it's a holiday, go home. He's trying to stop runs after that second crash of 32. He's trying to stop further bank runs. So he says, first of all, it's a bank holiday, everyone go home, your money is going to be safe. He immediately passes the Emergency Banking Act, gives money to endangered banks. That Glass-Steagall Act that I mentioned reforms how banks can invest in the stock market. That was overturned in the 90s. It's that FDIC that says, even if your bank fails, your money is going to be safe. Leave your money in the bank. Don't take it all out and go home with it. So he's working in conjunction with the banks. The banks are grateful for this help, but you can already see that now we have federal governments more entangled in banks than they had been. And he doesn't stop there. We talk about president's first 100 days because FDR did so much in his first 100 days. This is where the idea of the first 100 days starts with. And I'm not going to tell you everything that he did. I'm just going to list a bunch of stuff that you don't need to worry about. He creates the National Recovery Administration. That's this NRA. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The federal government gets very involved in farmers' lives in some ways that make them very unhappy. He creates things like the Civilian Conservation Corps. You see them here. This is one of the first attempts in the New Deal to just create jobs. FDR says, what do people need? They need money, they need jobs. We'll make jobs for them. The Civilian Conservation Corps took young men, usually out of cities, and sent them out to national parks, sent them out. Here we see young men in Yosemite. And the idea was that they could do work for the national parks, that this would be healthy work to create strong bodies. The idea was that otherwise they would like turn to a life of crime. So again, you're seeing that, yeah, it's giving men jobs, but also getting very involved, right? That here's what you should eat every morning. Here's what you should do to get strong and healthy. I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit. Okay. So this Federal Emergency Relief Administration was the first to create temporary jobs. FDR is cautious with this. Hoover had refused to do this because he said this will make people dependent on the federal government. We can't be out here just giving people jobs. FDR moves cautiously, but he quickly finds that this is a real, that this is a solution that works, that getting jobs is a way to get money into hands of people who need it. So we're gonna see this amp up with two programs that I'm gonna tell you about. So I'm skipping a ton of stuff. The New Deal in agriculture, we're not talking about the Dust Bowl in this lecture. I'm skipping so much stuff to tell you about the PWA and the WPA. And you're like, why did they make all the acronyms? First of all, why is there so many acronyms? Why did they make them all the same? PWA, giant projects. WPA, small projects. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, created huge projects like the Cooley Dam in the upper Northwest, which actually also stole Native American land and flooded their farmland. All right, created huge projects like the, wait, hold on just a second. I think I have a picture of it. I don't have a picture of it. The Rural Electrification Agency. Let's get electricity into rural areas, especially in these deep pockets of poverty in the Appalachians. So you can see all of these large projects, airports, railroads, dams, schools, hospitals. This was the PWA, and it spent millions of dollars, and it was always over budget, by the way. Okay, now I'm skipping so much. Look at all the stuff that I'm skipping. Oh my gosh. Huey Long says, let's give everyone, okay, I gotta stop. I gotta talk about Huey Long right now though. Let me talk to Huey Long just for a second. Okay, so big projects, trying to get funds into people's hands. By 34, FDR is working on his New Deal, but by 34, other politicians like Huey Long, he's called the Kingfish of Louisiana, he has alternate plans, what he calls the share the wealth movement. Huey Long says everyone should get $5,000. Everyone should just have $5,000. By the way, you could buy a house with $5,000 in 1934. Huey Long claims to have 5 million supporters. He probably has a couple of million people who are interested in the share the wealth movement. FDR's New Deal is not Huey Long's share the wealth movement. And in fact, FDR is like, no, we're not doing that, Huey Long. But the popularity of the share the wealth movement pushes FDR to say, okay, well, I have to be doing more. Obviously, I have to be doing more, or people are just going to go over to Huey Long and his idea of giving everyone $5,000. You could buy a house, by the way, with $5,000. So the second New Deal is in part a response to the popularity of we need economic security. And that's what the second New Deal, still FDR, same administration, but the focus of the second New Deal is on that economic security. And the part of this that you're probably most familiar with is Social Security. So this is the creation of Social Security in America, and unemployment insurance, of course, which are very big deals right now. And we're living through a moment right now where the unemployment insurance itself is changing dramatically, and it'll be interesting to see if those changes stick around. But this is where it comes from. The Social Security Act, unemployment insurance. FDR says, all right, we're gonna recover from this, we're gonna reform the banks, we're gonna reform our financial systems, and we're going to make sure that people can be economically secure. Do you see that shift? It's not just economic opportunity, it's security. This is a very FDR perspective. Okay. I know, I'm skipping so much. Skipping it. Oh, skipping so many things. Skipping it. I'm skipping it. I want to talk about the WPA. All right. PWA, hospitals, schools, dams, airports, electrification, trains, very, very large projects. But in part, as a response to the share the wealth movement popularity, where FDR is like, okay, we have to work harder to get money into people's hands, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, is created to hire millions of Americans to do much smaller jobs. So let's talk about the WPA. The WPA, what do I want to tell you? It's directed by Harry Hopkins. You don't have to worry about that too much. Opponents of the WPA called it made up work. Like you're just making stuff up, and that's not totally wrong. Let's talk about some WPA projects. Here's a WPA project. Let's have an art exhibit in an alley. What's the point? Well, the point is you give people something edifying to look at, a break from the Great Depression, but you also can pay teachers. This is a children's art exhibit. You can pay teachers and artists to come and work with these children to create this exhibit. And what you're doing is getting money into their pockets for that week. Harry Hopkins said, look, artists have to eat too. Scholars, writers, directors, actors have to eat too. Not just the people laying bricks for the Cooley Dam, right? He says, all these other people have to eat too. Let's give them some jobs to do. So this is a really good example of that WPA. And you know what? I misquoted Harry Hopkins. Let me give you the direct quote because it's better than what I said. He said, hell, they've got to eat like other people. He says, hell, they got to eat too. Let's give them some money. But like I said, he had a lot of critics. Like, you're just making jobs up. What are you doing? Now, the WPA, so this is like the smallest job that you can imagine, right? Let's put on an art exhibit in an alley. The WPA also paid for actors and directors to put on plays. They paid for hundreds of academics, scholars, and writers to go into the South and talk to elderly African Americans who had been enslaved or whose parents had been enslaved. And one of the best resources that historians have now is these interviews. And they were paid to do this by the WPA. The WPA projects could be a little bit larger though too. So let's talk about some, and I want to say one more thing about the WPA projects and their size. They could also be done in conjunction with big projects. So PWA might be like, let's build a stadium. WPA comes in and says, and let's hire artists to make murals in that stadium. So I want to show you a couple of things. If you've got questions, put them in chat. I know I'm just like talking. This is what I get for making half-hour lectures. So this is the Living New Deal map. It's easy to find. You can just look up Living New Deal map or New Deal map, and it actually works better on mobile. And let's look at San Antonio. And as I zero in on San Antonio, does anyone want to guess, or do you know of anything in San Antonio that's a New Deal project? No, that's all right. I'm going to tell you. So let me give it away. The Riverwalk. The Riverwalk is a New Deal project. The city of San Antonio had wanted to create a walkway, but during the Great Depression had run out of money, and the city of San Antonio, they created the bypass, and they were going to pave over the horseshoe. Can you imagine the horseshoe just not existing? They were just going to pave it over. No one had money to do anything with it. The governor, Ma Richardson, she's Texas's first governor. She runs on a platform of being anti-Klan and pro-drinking. She's amazing. Look her up. I think there's some corruption with her husband, but you can look her up, Ma Richardson. But she helps to get this New Deal money into Texas, and some of that New Deal money goes to creating the Riverwalk. So that's not a tiny project, but the reason that the Riverwalk has murals and art is WPA money. And also, let's bring artists in. Some other local stuff, Alamo Stadium is a New Deal project. And the murals for Alamo Stadium are a WPA project. Let's bring in artists and make murals. Other New Deal projects that you might see around town. Let me see if I can never remember where they are. There's some good ones downtown. So the Riverwalk, you can see the tiles are a WPA project. I think there's some art in the post office. So the post office itself is a New Deal project. The murals are a WPA project. And you'll find WPA murals in post offices all around the country. Some other New Deal projects that we didn't talk about as much include public housing. And we have a couple of examples of that in San Antonio, if I can remember where. This is Victoria Courts, this is gonna be Apache Courts, and this is gonna be Lincoln Heights Courts. So these three public housing projects were New Deal projects, and we are in Texas. This is the 1930s. They were segregated. Victoria Courts was for white Texans, Lincoln Heights for African Americans, and Apache Courts for Latino Texans. So there's a couple of good projects around here. Like I said, I think we already looked at Alamo Stadium. It's a railroad underpass. That's not as exciting. Some of them aren't terribly exciting. They're like something you needed, just some infrastructure. But Alamo Stadium, of course, is one of the New Deal projects. Plenty of football stadiums are New Deal projects as well. All right, this is some historical background. You have an activity that's a little dense, and it's one that you should devote a little bit of time to. Sorry, I've got too many things pulled up. Let me pull up what's actually useful for you. Here we go. All right. So you have this extra credit optional if you want to learn more about the Dust Bowl, which is a man-made environmental disaster that happens during the Great Depression. Like, the timing could not have been worse. You can learn about the Dust Bowl. You can learn about Dorothea Lange. She's a WPA photographer. She takes pictures during the Dust Bowl, and she's the one who photographed some of these pictures that I showed you for the deportations activity. She photographed these Mexican-American families. And here you can see that the photographer says, this woman told me, my children sometimes say, maybe we should go, or she says, I'm sorry, she told Dorothea Lange, sometimes I think I would like to go back to Mexico, but my children say, no, we belong here. So she took some of the photographs that we have that relate to those unconstitutional deportations. So this activity is a little odd, and you can actually find everything from here. If you just want to jump straight into the quiz, you'll find links to everything else that you need, but I'm asking you to do a lot. I'm asking you to listen to an interview with a man he's an American citizen who was deported as a child. I'm asking you to read an article that, like all secondary sources, has a very clear perspective or bias. I invite you at the end of the quiz to engage with that perspective and let me know what you think about that. And then I ask you to choose a roll sheet, whichever you would like, that's actually written as an indictment. So it will read unfairly, and your task will be to defend. Now, one of the things that I want to stress here is, as you defend, so if you choose the federal government, in your defense, root it in the historical context, because there's a very strong defense for the federal government in the historical context of the deportations of the 1930s. So as you respond to these, of course, you'll be influenced by today's immigration discussions, but I want you to root your defense in the historical context, because I promise your defense will be more historically rich and interesting if you actually root it in its own times. I'm just going to give something away here. The point of this activity is to understand that there's not a single person, a single bill, a single agency that's responsible for these unconstitutional deportations. That's kind of the point of the activity. So we're 6:30 on the nose. I'm so impressed, and I have to drink so much water right now. I'm going to stop recording, but if anyone has any questions about other stuff in the class, or questions about what I just told you, or you just need clarification on an assignment, please feel free to stick around. I'm going to go ahead and stop.